evening, everybody. This is Dr. Hack, and we are going to take a short break from our Sicilian opening to do a quick survey, I'm going to make a roadmap for you of all of the openings that come up when you play the move 1e4 and kind of their different flavors. I think, I take this stuff for granted because I've played this game for so long. I've seen so many of these a lot. And so I know where these games go when somebody plays back a certain move and kind of how it works and all the different nuances of it. But when you're just getting going, I suppose that it might be helpful to have somebody just lay it out for you. Say, this is the work you got to do if you want to play e4. That'd be nice, huh? Right. So I'm going to use the database to help us understand where we are on that roadmap. And I'm going to use the amateur database. So this is all of the players on leadchess.org between 1,000 and 2,000 rating, just in Blitz and Rapid. That's what you're looking at. 1.8 billion games. It's a lot of data to sift through, huh? Right. So, first things first. Look down in the chapters below you there and, below the video. And if there are a lot of, chapters, which there are going to be, pick the ones you're interested in. Because I have a feeling this is going to be the longest video I've ever made. Just a hunch. Okay. Let's start with the big one. Let's start with e5. Now, the reason I think this one is the most popular is because if we take this down to the beginners, and I'll even add in the 400s, you get so many of them playing e5 back because there were these guys like Alekhine and Larson and Nimzovich back in the 1920s and before that said, hey, these center four squares are important. We should take over those center four squares if we can and contest them. And, some of those guys said you should do it with your pieces, and some of those guys said you should do it classically with the pawns. There was a war between hypermodern and classical, but they all said the same thing. Thou shalt develop to the center, And so we all kind of follow that today. And every coach I've ever known has told the beginners, hey, you should do that. And this move lets the bishop out and lets the queen out. And so start there. Makes sense. So that's why they do it, because they've done it since the very beginning. And so you'll see them as we go up in rating filter into other openings. This number will continue to get smaller, and these numbers down here will continue to get bigger. More variety. It's good stuff. But when they do this, we actually have a video series already to cover this on the Roy Lopez. But if you were looking for alternatives, right, for playing white, there are plenty of options. If you wanted to play the move f4, you would get into something called the King's Gambit. And I may not say all the names. If you'd like to know the name of an opening, you can look at over here and see the code and the opening. This is just the old school way of looking at it. We still use those even though we don't need them anymore because we have databases that will just tell us stuff. So if you play this f4 move, what happens is it sets up a big attack for white exactly on this square. Your bishop usually ends up here, your queen and rook end up lined up along this row, and these pawns trade off at some moment in the future, and we end up with an attack at f7. That's powerful at the amateur level to make an attack there. You'll see that in several of the openings we're going to look at against e4, e5. And the flavor of this one is tactical. This is an opening that you would play if you want to just have a wild tactical ride where you're definitely going to miss things, and so is your opponent. Okay. There is one way I know of that black can just kind of crush your spirit in this one, and that is if he plays a counter gambit and puts a pawn in the middle. You can see it happening here, where their score goes way up, right? It's because that kind of closes down your attack along this diagonal, your early attack. You were going to give up material for that. And now black has said back to you, no, I'm going to give up material to stop you. It works really well, guys. So this counter gambit, good stuff. Watch out for that one. Okay. If we get into the classical methods with just putting the knight out instead of playing a gambit, we end up with 2 or 3 main possibilities that work very, very well. One of them is the Italian game. And the Italian game, much like the King's Gambit, is a tactical skirmish early on against the pawn at f7. We've made that into a thing that's attacked once and defended once. And because we've done that, it's a soft spot now. And so you'll see lots of games where black will develop and then white will immediately go after it. You see that that's the most popular move for amateurs. Because somebody told them a long time ago, when they were first starting, that there was a thing called the fried liver where you sacrifice a knight here. And they said, fried liver? That sounds disgusting. I want to play it. I don't know if you like fried liver or not. It's hit or miss, with people. But that's the soft spot, and that's the one they go after. And you see even things like this Traxler Gambit, which is well YouTubed and well documented. I will never be making a video on this, I promise. Which is a counterattack where you take this thing and make the fork, and then black goes after you and tries to checkmate you, and it's just a wild ride. Again, King's Gambit stuff, Italian stuff, these are big attacks on f7, or can be. If you chose to take this on in a more strategic way, like, say, playing the move pawn to d3, and then playing the move pawn to c3, and then playing eventually the move pawn to d4, that would be a much more strategic style of build-up, less than tactical, right? You're not going to go after this, you're going to do something else. Italian players are much less likely to do something like that at the beginner level, but the higher rated you go, the much more likely they are to do that. 71% of masters play it this way, okay? Because the strategic build-up is the most solid way to take this on with white. The tactical wins when the opponent knows all the tactics don't work, right? So that's the Italian. Now, I believe that strategic build-up happens much more often when you play the Roy Lopez, which is the one that we've studied together on the channel. And so I'm not going to go into this one too deeply. You can go click, find the playlist, play those videos. They're quite thorough. But this is that strategic build-up again through the middle. There's less tactics happening here that work, much more tactics that don't work, and therefore the battle is more for strategy and for position. Okay. The third option that you would have here with white, if you were to really pick something different than what we've looked at, is you could play the Scotch Game. And the Scotch Game is characterized by this trade of pawns in the middle. It happens almost every time, right? You can see that in Masters and in amateurs. And you see in Masters, it says 100% here. Everybody who sees this is going to take the pawn because that is hands down the strongest move to play. Playing anything else leaves holes in the opening, okay, at highest levels. So we take the pawn and we end up with this different structure, more differenter than the Italian or the Roy Lopez, because the e-pawn is missing for black. And what that changes is it gives white a little bit of a space edge behind his pawns to develop. And so he is going to get the first attack every time if he wants it. Because that space advantage allows you to maneuver a little bit quicker into the game and put your pieces in a little bit better spots in the game early. Okay, the cramped up space makes you maybe move your pieces once or twice instead of just once, and that slows you down big time as you start to develop and they crash into each other as they're trying to get out. The other thing that characterizes the Scotch is the idea that there is a majority of pawns on this side of the board for white versus a minority of pawns, which is the king side. And that means that white often will throw his pawns at black in a king side pawn storm that works. It's a very nice way to play this one, which is why it's a little bit fun if you want to pick it up. Black has that majority on the queen side, this 4 against 3 over here. And that means that if he wants to throw his queen side pawns at you, absolutely can. And maybe even should, right? Great. If you felt like looking this up further and you wanted to know more about the pawn structure, it is called Knight's Jump Pawn Structure. I don't know if you'll ever need that. Maybe it's not important. Who knows? It was Andrew Soltis's work back in the 80s, I think. 1980s, not 1880s. Old, but not that old. Right. Okay. And then if we go back and we give white his last option here to play classically, that would be the Vienna game. For a beginner, you play this game, this Vienna game once or twice or maybe for 2 weeks, and you realize that it's the most boring game for a beginner ever conceived. Because our coaches tell us develop your pieces into the middle of the board, and so you do. And you end up with all these knights out, and the bishops go into these places, right? And this bishop comes into these places, and you play the same way symmetrically with your opponent over and over and over again until you realize that, we'd really like to mix this up. And you try to break through with the pawns, and you realize that you can't even do that because it's symmetrical. Whatever idea you can think of, they can also think of. And so getting something that's less symmetrical for a beginner is much more helpful to make ideas. This is a very exciting opening at the higher levels because stuff does happen, and it's quite good with tactics and whatnot. But early on, it's not. Okay? That's just my opinion. The last way that we can see white try things here at the very beginning against e5 is he's got these ideas of gambits coming the other way. He can give up a pawn or two, or in some cases even three pawns. And this gambit it's a gambit for time. Whether you stopped at 2 pawns and play this knight captures, or whether you let him take all 3, it's a gambit for time, meaning you gave up material in order to get extra moves at the beginning of the game with your big pieces. And at the highest levels of chess, you need to get at least 3 extra turns per pawn that you give up in order to get an advantage, in order to get a true advantage where you can win every time, right, and force it to be a win. Otherwise, you're relying on your opponent's mistakes, which they do happen, quite often when you're attacking. And if you ask the question, did we get that much time with white? The answer is no. We definitely did not. We got definitely two extra turns per pawn, but not 3. Okay, so black has a chance here if we look at the Masters database to actually outplay his opponent and either get a draw or a win most of the time. Yeah, well over 50% of the time. So you won't see Masters playing this very, very often at all. Gambit for time, but you don't get enough time. It's unsound. You can see all the wins here for black. Okay. So that brings us into, very weird stuff. Perhaps you decide that you'd like to just go straight up with like c3. Well, when you do something like that, when you leave these ones that I've just described, you're transposing those other openings in a different move order. You will eventually reach the same or similar positions with the pawns, and that will make the game kind of play like those other ones. The next most popular option when you're trying to play against e4 is to play a Sicilian defense, the one that we're studying now on the channel. And this one is, again, one that gets more popularity the higher rated you go. As a matter of fact, it is the most popular opening in all of chess at the master level. 46% of games will go this way, mostly because the opening is so big that it gives great opportunities to outplay a lower rated opponent. And many of the lines can go tactical or strategic, depending on what flavor the player playing black wants to guide the game into. And giving black that much control in an opening is exactly what a higher rated player wants. And so since they control it, they love it, and it shows in the stats how much they love it. So when you play a Sicilian, the ways that white could take this on, right? He could take it on in the most classical sense, which is, again, the master's choice. This is the one that offers the biggest range of opportunities to outplay an opponent, the expert way to go. Or you could take it on in an anti-Sicilian fashion, which is everything else. Okay, if you're not playing knight to f3, d4, you're playing an anti-Sicilian. So you can classify them that way. Especially the black players, I think they do. They classify the open Sicilian and then everything else in another category. So when we're playing anything else, here are the options that you have. Okay, you could play a C3 Sicilian or an Alekhine. And the idea to do that is that we're just going to play another pawn to the middle and try to hold that pawn in the center. The black player has two main and very good options when they're trying to take this on, and that shows in the Masters. I need to get back to the amateurs because the amateurs don't necessarily do these things, right? They don't know. And one of those ways that black should take this on is he should simply attack the pawn that you can't defend with a knight anymore. And he can do that either with a knight or with a pawn. And the reason why he can get away with this kind of thing is because usually we would say a queen in the middle of the board is not so good. Well, this one can't be attacked by a knight in short order, and if the pawn moves, we're going to move the queen anyways. So the knight will never gain time against the queen coming into the game. So it's kind of okay to do that. And so that's kind of the main way to take this on, is to attack that e-pawn. But you see that, many of the amateurs, they don't know that. This is the most popular move, which is a complete mistake. And this is the second most popular move, which is also a complete mistake. Okay, and so maybe picking up the C3 Sicilian, while the third most popular move, is also a big mistake. That's incredible, guys. Okay, that's one way to do it. The next way that you could play an anti-Sicilian is to play the one that we're studying on the channel, which is to play the closed Sicilian. Play knight to c3, and then close the pawns with a pawn at d3 at some point in the future. And since we're studying that one on the channel, let's not go too deep into that one. Okay, you can come back and see the video series on the Sicilian. There's a playlist and everything. Awesome. The third way I would say that's an anti-Sicilian that works, these are all ones that work, guys. This is why it's so big, is you could play the move pawn to f4, which is a Grand Prix attack. Or you could play knight to c3, and then on your next move, pawn to f4, which is also called a Grand Prix attack. And it doesn't go into that name, and I honestly don't know why. It probably should. The reason why you would do something like this, the reason why you would play this way, is because you know that your opponent has a tendency to put pawns on the sixth row, which guards all the squares on the fifth row. And this gives you the best options to break through that fifth row and try to get rid of some of those pawns. It's a very nice, spicy, kingside attacky opening where you're trying to attack, especially if they play the move pawn to g6, which is very common in this opening to do. Yeah, there's another one of the anti-Sicilians. Again, that's part of the opening that we're covering on the channel. So maybe just wait until we put out a couple more videos on that and you'll understand more about that one too. That's the main flavors of anti-Sicilians. There's one gambit to be aware of, this wing gambit, which the whole purpose of the wing gambit is to be able to put pawns in the middle, the same way that we did c3 and then d4. We got a pawn in the middle, and this pawn is eventually going to get recaptured. It's not able to be defended in a great way. It's okay, right? The more energy black puts into defending it, the less likely he is to succeed in the game, because he should be using his energy elsewhere to play moves like d5 and try to break through the middle and get the pieces out. So that's fine. That's another one that's pretty okay. What about the French defense? The next option for black. I would say that this particular opening is defined, is a good way to put it. If I had to sum it up in one word, the plans that black uses are very well defined. He will know them, very well, because they're not complicated plans. They're very simple plans. And because of the simplicity of the planning part of it, many players are drawn to this as black as they get further up, because they know exactly what to do. Even though sometimes it doesn't work out so well, right? Because they're in a cramped position, they still know exactly what to do. And so you get a certain type of player playing this. Somebody who's really good at positional breakthrough style of chess where the centers all locked together. Because even if we trade the pawns, even if we play the exchange variation, the center is still locked together. It's just a semi-open center instead of a closed center. And if the pawns move, and lock together completely, now it's a completely closed center of the board. Black knows that they have to move the play to the wings. And the most common way to do that is to move to the queen side, although they can also do it on the king side if they try to get some moves over here to work, like f5 or f6. So because of that defined nature of this opening, white often attempts to play moves that do not allow the center to lock. They try to push it into tactical means. And so you get the Winawer, the things where the knight develops instead of closing the pawns up, and we try to keep it fluid and ready to lock together, right? Unfortunately, with this one, again, the plans are just very, very well defined as to what we need to do with black in order to make white want to play this e5 pawn move. And maybe even need to, right? Maybe it's the only move. 78% of the masters agree that's the move to play. Okay, so then you come up with moves like this one, the Tarrasch, which stops that bishop from pinning, which means you will never have to play this pawn up if you don't want to. This is the way that I take this on. This one tends to get the most tactical, open style of positions that you can get within the French. So take it how you will, but realize that you're playing against a very specific style of opponent, and that's going to offer you options with psychology in the game to try to push them out of their comfort zone. And maybe you should. Maybe you should take them on in a two knights French where you put both knights out instead of playing the pawn to d4. Maybe you should, because that will take away their planning, the thing that they know the best, to play this up, lock the center, and play c5. I'll leave that to you. Good. So the next possibility that they have is to play the Scandinavian. And the Scandinavian is black's attempt to ruin your space advantage that white gets in every opening, almost every opening, unless they play something silly like the Larsen. This one is really dangerous for white in the first, let's say, 7 moves. If white sets up correctly, the middle game is better for him. But because of the early pressure, this one is better for black as an amateur. Okay, now that's weird because at master level, this one's going to be much better for white. And at amateur level, this is probably much better for black. Depends on how low on the ladder you are as to whether this works a lot. Okay, but the trick to it is that when black plays his normal setup, right, with the Scandinavian, where the queen ends up over here on a5, you get a very big fight over the center of the board, specifically with that pawn getting pressurized, where black is going to attack that thing a whole bunch of times and eventually pin it to the queen down the d file and make it very difficult for white to defend, right? If he plays the knight out here, let's play a couple more moves here. He will definitely remove the defenders of this pawn by pinning, right, at some point in this opening. And so in order to get that edge, or in order to avoid giving black that edge, we have to play very, very accurate moves, right, early on to relieve the pressure of this pawn before the rook arrives and we can't do anything about it and we're going to lose it. And so I do think that this is very tactical and very tricky, the way I would characterize it. And I would say that black does win many early games. He wins that pawn early on in a lot of games, or gets that advantage. So beware of this one. Yeah, I believe this opening goes away the higher up you go. And as a matter of fact, if you look at Masters, you see how white's got this big edge, right? They're winning a ton. They're getting a lot of draws. Black's not winning very much. And so that's why it kind of falls off into favor the higher up you go. So this is one, again, that you start out with a higher percentage of players doing it, and then as you get better, it even gets less. Where was it? 9% now. It will get less the higher you go. as other things increase, like the Sicilian and the French and the Caro. They all get better. Okay. That brings us to our Caro-Kann, which is the one that we learned with black. This is our beginner opening with black. Now, the reason why I chose this one on the channel to teach you guys as a beginner opening is because it gives you the widest variety, I believe, of any opening in styles of games that come up. Okay, and so you're going to get exposure to open games and closed games. You're going to get exposure to tactical games. You're going to get exposure to planned games. Games where time is the most important thing, or games where the positional features of the board are the most important thing. And so that's why I introduced this one to you guys as beginners, just because it gives you a safe exposure and a solid way to play with black to everything. And so because of that, because of this wide variety of things, or because we've already covered most of it very thoroughly, again, I don't know that I need to spend a lot of time here. Just go find the playlist for Caro-Kann and watch through. It gets real spicy around the third video, I think, when I start really taking things apart. Cool. The next one on the list, we start getting down into the modern and hyper-modern openings. And these are the things that Nimzovich and Larson made famous with their ideas that we should take over the center, yes, but we shouldn't do it with the pawns. We should do it with the pieces and leave things flexible and leave the ability to put any pawn in the middle we want to later. That's all fine at their mastery of the game. When we start doing this as beginners, it's actually quite challenging to make it work right. Now, the thing that we have going for us is that none of our opponents will ever have studied anything remotely close to this because of how rarely it comes up. They've played 45 games in this one and only 3 in this one, right? And so they're not seeing it very often. They're not practicing it, and they're not studying it either. So that's your advantage if you're playing this with black. With white, we can characterize this one as a space opening. We are going to develop and take over the big amount of space where our pieces can sit behind our pawns and then generate the first attack. But because we took so much space, that space comes under attack and it comes under fire. And when it comes under fire, we have to decide how best to handle it. Are we going to trade the pawns off? Are we just going to lock it all together? How exactly are we going to do that, right? And I have, the opinion that that this one is easy for white. You just have to pick up one system in it, one way to play. For example, I like to play the one where we develop our bishop this way. I find that one very, very nice and a very good way to kind of pressurize the queen side of the board. But you could also do it very classically where the bishops both go into the center of the board and the knights both go into their most normal squares, and then you start looking for ways to play through the middle of the board. That's perfectly okay, legitimate. The one thing that we have to worry about with this one, and I realize this isn't one of the moves, but it's this possibility that when they play e5 and we trade these things off. Let me try 2 more moves. We could get ourselves into a situation where we think that trading this queen off makes us winning, which it absolutely does not do. Okay, it gives us it gives black the inability to castle, but this game is very far from over. It's a symmetrical pawn game, and it turns out to be very difficult to generate any advantage at all for either side. Okay, and so you're definitely not winning this, even though it feels like you are. I don't know why amateurs have such an easy time with that position exactly, but I do know that pawn structure lends itself to very tactical late middle games and end games actually, and not the opening or the early middle game. It doesn't do very much. Don't know if I described that very well, but I do urge caution in this one, in that pawn structure where they're symmetrical. You're going to need to study that more before you just swipe the queens off the board and say I'm winning. It's just not true. And again, when you find something like that, when I say something like that, you could potentially pick that idea up and play it with black and try to understand what I'm saying. You could try to beat down your opponents and let them take your queen and move your king over, and try it a lot and just see, why am I saying that? What's important about it? Why is that working? Because it is. And I think it has a lot to do with this piece being misplaced, but that's just me. Okay, so we come back and we go, okay, so the modern is a space style opening, and they can do it this way too. It doesn't change much at the beginner level to do that. The difference in this one is that since we've developed the bishop faster, we have pressure down to b2 earlier. And when they develop this bishop, right, we would expect them to, we can play a move like c5, and that will create a threat on the hanging pawn, so they won't be able to take it back or push it. That's the one thing you've got in this one that's different than playing the d6 move first and the knight out first, and then playing the pawn up and the bishop out, and getting here by move 6 rather than move 3. Basically, with the bishop developed and causing pressure. So that's a different move order. Again, as beginners, I don't think it changes the gameplay very much at all. I would say almost not. You're going to end up with very similar positions almost every time anyway, depending on what system white's adopted to play against it. And when I say adopted system, because there is no tension in the center, we can't use the center battle with pawns the same way we could in the other openings. We have to come up with some way to develop our pieces without having that crutch, that memory crutch. And so whether the knight's going to come to e2 or f3 is going to change your opening dramatically with this one, based on which system you've chosen to play. If the bishop goes to g2, it's going to change your opening ideas dramatically, whether it's over there or over here. But that's your choice as to how you do that. Okay. The last one that we're going to talk about here is this idea of, there's two more, my bad. Is this idea that you could play the same hypermodern thing on the other side of the board. Now, I happen to believe that this one is much worse than the bishop coming to the king side. And the reason why I believe that is because this idea that you could attack this pawn at g2 and maybe try to win the rook doesn't exist. It actually doesn't work. You'll lose the game if you do that. Okay? If we were to take this and black were to take the pawn, white to move just wins the game. And you see it happening most of the time here, although I don't know how they're not winning, because this is pretty much checkmate. It's almost over. So however white manages to lose this 30% of the time as amateurs, I have no idea. Well, let's not look. Let's not think about it too hard. But since that doesn't work, then the question that you have to ask yourself is, why am I doing this first? It doesn't offer me any extra opportunities than it would to do that in a minute after I've developed this other stuff, the d6 pawn, the knight out. Maybe we want to do that later. Don't know. Okay. The last one that I think has a reasonable following and some really good ideas is this Alekhine or Alekhine opening. And because of the nature of these hypermoderns, right? This is another hypermodern. What black is attempting to get us to do? They're trying to goad us. They're trying to prompt us to play our pawns forward too early. A move like e5 would make a very weak pawn, and it would break our center apart. They're trying to break our center apart, right? That's their job. But if we often will be tempted to do it for them, to push our pawns too far too soon. Well, this Alekhine opening is specifically that idea taken quicker on move 1. They want us to move our pawn forward. That's their job, is to get our pawns up here so far that they're attackable. When they play their d6 move, now this pawn is already under fire. It's exactly what they're looking for. Okay, and this is how this opening starts. Now, I think you could take this one on classically. I think it's a fine way to go. There are tactics that are unique to this one. For example, I believe I won a game against a 2300 last week with just playing this novelty that's not in the database. There's in the Masters database, nobody has ever played knight to g5. And I know I've studied this move because I thought one day I'll use this. And I finally did, and it worked. Because the tactics say that this sacrifice and this sacrifice are both sound a lot of the time. And so winning a quick game here and there is going to be kind of fun. But regardless, whether you do it that way or whether you decide that you're just going to take on classically and take the big center and chase his knight back and play a game, you can get a lot of mileage out of this one just understanding that it is in the hyper-modern family. And your job is to maintain your space, not press it forward and try to get some advantage early on. We're trying to maintain our space advantage so we can develop our pieces behind that and get some kind of attack before he's developed and ready. That's what we're trying to do. Good. I think that covers all of the e4 openings and all of the things that black might do to try to get an advantage, against us. They could try a6. We see that at the very bottom of the list down there. But this one is kind of punting the move back to you and saying, hey, this is a hyper-modern. You do whatever the heck you want. But I haven't played any move that actually develops anything yet. So you actually are getting an extra tempo too. So I don't feel like this one adds anything to the discussion that the hyper-modern stuff didn't already do. Perfect. I wish you guys a very good luck in all of those things, in all of these openings. As you improve, you'll notice that the distribution eventually ends up like this, where you're playing the Sicilian the most often, so that is the one you lean on and you learn the hardest as you progress, followed by e5, which is diminishing. The higher up you go, the less you'll see it, followed by the French and the Caro. If you were to just focus on these four, that would get you up to 1900, 2000. And if you learn something very basic against all the rest of them, you see them so infrequently, they don't affect your rating very much. Imagine winning 50% of your games here against the hyper-modern, or the modern. That's 2% of all of your games. Well, if you just win 2% more of your Sicilian games, it does exactly the same thing, right? One extra game out of 100 in the Sicilian. So again, diminishing returns, you don't see these enough to really get anything out of them until you're very high up. And so I suggest studying them at that time. I do hope this helps somebody. I know this was long. Hopefully it's good. You guys have a good one. Take care now. Bye.